Picture this. You come home from a relaxing weekend getaway, expecting to find your beautiful backyard pool sparkling in the afternoon sun, ready for a refreshing swim. Instead, you're greeted by a bone-dry concrete crater and a smug woman standing in your yard with a garden hose, claiming she had every legal right to drain 20,000 gallons of water because you were supposedly violating federal environmental laws. But here's the kicker. You don't even belong to the homeowners association she claims gave her this authority. You've never signed their documents, never paid their fees, and never agreed to their rules. Yet somehow, this self-appointed neighborhood enforcer believes she has the power to destroy your property in the name of justice. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below because you're about to witness one of the most outrageous displays of HOA overreach you've ever heard. This isn't just about a drained pool. It's about how far some people will go when they convince themselves they are the guardians of neighborhood standards, even when they have absolutely no legal authority to act. What you're about to discover will make you question everything you thought you knew about property rights, HOA power, and the length some people will go to enforce rules that don't even apply. Trust me, by the end of this story, you'll be as shocked as I was when I learned the real reason behind this woman's obsession with my pool. My name is Marcus, and until last summer, I thought I had found the perfect home. After years of apartment living and saving every penny, I finally purchased a beautiful 2-story house in what appeared to be an idyllic suburban neighborhood in Phoenix, Arizona. The house came with everything I had dreamed of: a spacious backyard, mature landscaping, and most importantly, a gorgeous in-ground pool that had clearly been the previous owner's pride and joy. The neighborhood itself seemed like something out of a magazine. Tree-lined streets with well-maintained sidewalks, houses with manicured lawns, and that peaceful suburban atmosphere I had been craving after years of city noise. During my house hunting process, my real estate agent mentioned that about 60% of the homes in the area belonged to something called Sunset Ridge HOA, but she assured me that my particular property was not part of their jurisdiction. This distinction was actually one of the selling points for me. I had heard enough horror stories about homeowners associations, the petty rules, the surprise fees, the power-hungry board members who treated neighborhood governance like their personal kingdom. The fact that I could enjoy the benefits of living in a well-maintained area without subjecting myself to HOA oversight seemed like the best of both worlds. The previous owners, an elderly couple named the Hendersons, had been meticulous caretakers. They walked me through every detail of the property during our final walkthrough, paying special attention to the pool maintenance routine. Mrs. Henderson explained how they had installed a state-of-the-art filtration system just 2 years prior, and how the pool's positioning caught morning sun while staying shaded during the harshest afternoon hours. She even left me a detailed binder with maintenance schedules, chemical balance charts, and contact information for their trusted pool service company. For the first few months, everything was absolutely perfect. I established a routine of morning swims before work and evening relaxation sessions after long days at my engineering job. The pool quickly became my sanctuary, a place where I could decompress, exercise, and simply enjoy the investment I had worked so hard to afford. My immediate neighbors seemed friendly enough during our brief encounters. There was the retired teacher Mrs. Patterson to my left, who always waved when she tended to her impressive rose garden. To my right lived a young family, the Johnsons, whose children occasionally asked if they could retrieve their stray soccer balls from my yard. Everyone seemed respectful of property boundaries and minded their own business, which was exactly the kind of neighborhood dynamic I was hoping for. But if you've ever lived in suburbia, you know there's always that one person who somehow makes everyone else's business their personal concern. In Sunset Ridge, that person was Linda Morrison, and although I didn't know it yet, she would soon become the antagonist in the most bizarre property dispute I could have ever imagined. Linda lived 3 houses down from me, directly across the street, in a perfectly maintained colonial-style home with what appeared to be professionally managed landscaping. Even from a distance, you could tell she took enormous pride in her property's appearance. Her lawn was consistently the greenest on the block. Her flower beds looked like they belonged in a gardening magazine, and her driveway was so clean you could probably eat off the concrete. During my first few months in the neighborhood, our interactions were limited to polite waves and the occasional comment about the weather. Linda always seemed friendly enough, though there was something about the way she observed the neighborhood that suggested she was cataloging details that most people wouldn't notice or care about. She had a habit of taking long walks in the evening, but these weren't leisurely strolls. They were methodical surveys of every property, every parked car, every lawn sprinkler, and every trash can placement. Remember this detail about Linda's evening walks, because it becomes crucial to understanding how this entire situation spiraled out of control. You see, Linda wasn't just a concerned neighbor with high standards. She was the current president of the Sunset Ridge HOA board, and she had been in that position for over 6 years. According to other neighbors I would later speak with, Linda approached her role with the kind of intensity usually reserved for Fortune 500 CEOs managing billion-dollar companies. But here's where things get interesting, and this is the detail that will make everything else in this story even more infuriating. Linda knew from day one that my property was not part of her HOA's jurisdiction. The neighborhood's property records were publicly available, and as HOA president, she had access to detailed maps showing exactly which homes fell under their authority and which didn't. My house, along with about 8 others on various streets, had been deliberately excluded when the original HOA boundaries were established 15 years earlier. So why was Linda so interested in my property? That question wouldn't be answered until much later. But the clues were there from the beginning if you knew what to look for. During those evening walks, Linda's pace would noticeably slow when she passed my house. She would pause to examine my landscaping choices, the positioning of my outdoor furniture, and most intriguingly, she spent considerable time observing my pool area from the sidewalk. At the time, I interpreted this behavior as simple neighborly curiosity. Maybe she was admiring the pool design, or perhaps she was considering similar upgrades to her own backyard. It never occurred to me that Linda was conducting what essentially amounted to surveillance, looking for any detail that might justify future interference in my property management decisions. The first real sign of trouble came in early June, about 4 months after I had moved in. I received a polite but oddly formal letter in my mailbox, written on official Sunset Ridge HOA letterhead. The letter was signed by Linda in her capacity as board president, and it contained what she described as friendly neighborhood reminders about community standards and property maintenance expectations. Now, before we continue, let me tell you exactly what this letter said, because it's a perfect example of how some people use official-sounding language to create authority where none actually exists. The letter began with pleasantries about welcoming new residents to the Sunset Ridge community family, but quickly shifted into a detailed list of what Linda described as voluntary guidelines that all residents were encouraged to follow in the interest of maintaining neighborhood property values and aesthetic harmony. These guidelines covered everything from acceptable paint colors and landscaping choices to noise restrictions and parking protocols. But the section that caught my attention was specifically about swimming pools and water features. According to Linda's letter, pool owners were strongly advised to maintain their water features according to specific chemical balance standards to ensure proper filtration system maintenance, and most peculiarly to avoid any pool-related activities that might be considered environmentally irresponsible under federal and state regulations. The letter concluded with an invitation to attend the next HOA board meeting, where new residents could learn more about how to be contributing members of our thriving community. There was also a subtle suggestion that while HOA membership wasn't mandatory for all homeowners in the area, participation in community standards was appreciated by everyone who had chosen to make Sunset Ridge their home. My initial reaction was a mixture of amusement and mild irritation. The letter was clearly written by someone who was accustomed to having their suggestions treated as commands, but the language was carefully crafted to avoid making any direct demands or explicit threats. Linda was smart enough to know she couldn't legally enforce HOA rules on non-member properties, but she was testing the waters to see how I would respond to her friendly guidance. I decided to ignore the letter completely. I wasn't a member of their organization, I hadn't signed their covenants, and I had no intention of allowing someone else to dictate how I maintained my own property. My pool was professionally serviced, my chemical levels were properly balanced, and my property was kept in excellent condition. There was absolutely nothing in my behavior that justified anyone's concern, let alone intervention. But Linda Morrison was not the type of person who accepted being ignored. 2 weeks after her initial letter, I came home from work to find her standing in my driveway, wearing what appeared to be her most official-looking business attire and carrying a clipboard with several sheets of paper attached. She had clearly been waiting for me because she approached my car before I had even finished parking. Her tone was friendly but firm as she introduced herself properly for the first time and explained that she had been hoping to speak with me about my property maintenance routine. She mentioned that several neighbors had expressed concerns about pool-related activities that might not be in compliance with local environmental regulations, and she wanted to discuss how we could address these issues before they became more serious problems. When I asked her to be specific about what exactly these concerns were, Linda's explanation became increasingly convoluted. She mentioned something about water drainage patterns, chemical runoff, and potential violations of federal clean water standards. She suggested that my pool's filtration system might not be adequate for Arizona's environmental requirements, and she hinted that there might be issues with how I was disposing of pool maintenance waste. None of this made any sense to me. My pool service company was licensed and bonded. They followed all local regulations for chemical handling and waste disposal, and my property had been professionally inspected before I purchased it. I explained this to Linda and asked her to provide specific documentation of these supposed violations or concerns. That's when her friendly facade began to crack. Linda's voice became sharper as she explained that as a long-term resident and community leader, she had a responsibility to address potential problems before they escalated into legal issues. She claimed that her years of experience dealing with municipal regulations and environmental compliance gave her the expertise to identify problems that newer residents might not recognize. But here's the part that should have been my biggest red flag. Linda never once mentioned that I wasn't a member of her HOA. She spoke as if her authority extended to every property in the neighborhood, and she acted as though my cooperation with her demands was simply expected rather than optional. I politely but firmly told Linda that I appreciated her concerns, but that I was confident in my property maintenance routine and wasn't interested in changing anything based on her suggestions. I explained that if there were legitimate legal issues with my pool or property management, I would address them through proper official channels rather than neighborhood committees. Linda's response was a tight smile and a comment that she hoped I would reconsider my position before the situation became more complicated. She handed me another letter, this one describing the next HOA board meeting and suggesting that my attendance would demonstrate my commitment to being a responsible community member. After she left, I called my pool service company to double-check that we were following all applicable regulations. They confirmed that everything we were doing was not only legal, but exceeded the minimum requirements for residential pool maintenance. They also mentioned that they had been servicing pools in that neighborhood for over a decade and had never encountered any environmental compliance issues. I should have realized then that Linda's concerns had nothing to do with legitimate regulatory compliance and everything to do with establishing control over my property. But I was still operating under the assumption that reasonable people could disagree without escalating to destructive behavior. How wrong I was. Over the next month, Linda's campaign of harassment intensified steadily. I began receiving weekly letters, each one more official-sounding than the last, warning me about various aspects of my property management that supposedly violated community standards or environmental regulations. These letters covered everything from the timing of my pool cleaning routine to the brand of chemicals my service company used to the frequency of my water testing schedule. But Linda wasn't content to limit her campaign to written correspondence. She began showing up at my property unannounced, always with a clipboard and always with new concerns that needed immediate attention. Sometimes she would arrive while my pool service technician was working, attempting to interrogate him about our maintenance procedures and chemical usage. Other times she would appear while I was relaxing in my backyard, interrupting my peaceful evening with lengthy explanations of neighborhood standards I was supposedly failing to meet. The most intrusive incident occurred on a Saturday morning in mid-July. I was enjoying a quiet breakfast on my back patio when I noticed Linda standing at my side gate, apparently trying to get a better view of my pool area. When I asked what she was doing, she claimed she had received reports of unusual chemical odors coming from my property and needed to investigate whether my pool maintenance was creating environmental hazards for neighboring homes. This was absolutely ridiculous. My pool used standard residential chemicals in standard quantities, applied by licensed professionals according to manufacturer specifications. The idea that my property was creating environmental hazards was not just wrong, it was insulting. I told Linda in no uncertain terms that she was not welcome on my property without permission and that her continued harassment was becoming a serious problem. I threatened to contact local authorities if she didn't stop her unauthorized visits and baseless accusations. Linda's response was chilling in its calm certainty. She told me that community leaders sometimes had to make difficult decisions to protect neighborhood property values and environmental safety, even when individual residents didn't understand the bigger picture. She suggested that my refusal to cooperate with community standards was creating liability issues that might eventually require more formal intervention. Looking back now, I realize this conversation was Linda's way of warning me that she was preparing to escalate her campaign beyond letters and surprise visits. But at the time, I interpreted her words as empty threats from someone who was frustrated that her neighborhood authority play wasn't working on me. The next escalation came in the form of official government inspections. Over the course of 3 weeks in August, I had surprise visits from the county health department, the Municipal Environmental Compliance Office, and the State Water Quality Management Agency. Each inspector arrived with complaints that had been filed against my property, alleging various violations of pool maintenance and environmental regulations. Every single inspection concluded that my property was in full compliance with all applicable regulations. In fact, 2 of the inspectors complimented me on the quality of my pool maintenance routine and the condition of my property overall. But the pattern was clear. Someone was systematically filing false complaints against me in an attempt to create official documentation of problems that didn't actually exist. When I asked each inspector who had filed the complaints, they couldn't provide specific names due to anonymity policies, but they could tell me that the complaints had come from someone claiming to represent neighborhood environmental concerns. The timing and specificity of the complaints made it obvious that Linda was behind this campaign of harassment, but I couldn't prove it directly. That's when I decided to fight back with documentation of my own. I started by researching Linda Morrison's background and her history as HOA president, and what I discovered was both enlightening and deeply troubling. Linda had been involved in neighborhood governance for over a decade, but her current position of power had only been achieved after a series of increasingly aggressive campaigns against previous board members who had tried to limit her influence. According to several former neighbors I managed to track down, Linda had a pattern of identifying homeowners who didn't conform to her vision of neighborhood standards and systematically harassing them until they either complied with her demands or moved away entirely. Her methods included filing false complaints with government agencies, organizing neighborhood pressure campaigns, and in at least 2 documented cases, encouraging HOA members to engage in property damage disguised as community improvement activities. But the most important thing I learned was that Linda's authority as HOA president was far more limited than she pretended. The Sunset Ridge HOA had legal jurisdiction over only 60% of the homes in the area, and their covenants explicitly stated that they had no authority to enforce rules or regulations on non-member properties. Linda knew this, but she had been successfully bluffing her way into controlling non-member homeowners for years by using official-sounding letters and implied threats of legal action. Armed with this information, I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting to confront Linda directly about her harassment campaign. The meeting was held in the community center of a nearby shopping complex, and when I arrived, I found about 20 homeowners seated in folding chairs facing a long table where Linda and 4 other board members were conducting their monthly business. I had prepared a detailed presentation about my property rights, Linda's pattern of harassment, and the legal limitations of HOA authority over non-member properties. I was ready to expose her behavior in front of the entire community and demand that she stop her campaign of false complaints and property surveillance. But Linda was one step ahead of me. Before I could even introduce myself, Linda announced that the evening's agenda included a special presentation about environmental compliance issues affecting the entire neighborhood. She claimed that recent inspections had revealed serious concerns about water quality management and chemical disposal practices that required immediate community action. What followed was a masterpiece of manipulation disguised as public service. Linda presented a slideshow filled with official-looking charts, government regulations, and environmental impact statistics that painted a picture of a neighborhood under siege from irresponsible property owners who were creating health hazards and legal liabilities for everyone else. She never mentioned my name specifically, but every detail in her presentation was clearly designed to describe my property and pool maintenance routine. She talked about homeowners who refused to cooperate with community standards, pool owners who used excessive chemicals, and residents who ignored neighborhood input about environmental compliance. She even included photos that had obviously been taken during her unauthorized surveillance of my property. The genius of Linda's presentation was that she positioned herself as the community's protector against outside threats, rather than acknowledging that she was the one creating problems where none had existed before. By the time she finished speaking, several HOA members were expressing outrage about irresponsible neighbors who were supposedly putting everyone's property values at risk. When Linda finally gave me the opportunity to respond, I found myself in the impossible position of defending against accusations that were technically never made. I couldn't directly address Linda's claims about my property without confirming that I was the target of her campaign, but I also couldn't ignore the presentation without appearing to validate her concerns. I tried to explain that HOA authority was limited to member properties and that non-member homeowners had the right to manage their properties according to legal standards without neighborhood committee oversight. I pointed out that all recent government inspections of properties in the area had found full compliance with environmental regulations, and I questioned the accuracy of Linda's claims about health hazards and legal violations. But Linda had successfully framed the conversation in a way that made me appear to be arguing against environmental responsibility and community cooperation. Every point I raised was met with concerned murmurs from HOA members who had been convinced that their neighborhood was under threat from selfish residents who refused to follow common-sense safety standards. The meeting ended with Linda promising to continue monitoring environmental compliance issues and to take whatever steps were necessary to protect the community from potential legal and health hazards. Several members thanked her for her dedication to neighborhood safety and encouraged her to pursue more formal enforcement mechanisms if voluntary cooperation wasn't sufficient. I left that meeting knowing that Linda had successfully positioned herself as the victim of my unreasonable resistance to community standards, while simultaneously building public support for whatever escalation she was planning next. I didn't have to wait long to find out what that escalation would look like. 3 days after the board meeting, I left town for a long weekend visiting my sister in California. It was a trip I had been planning for months, and I was looking forward to some time away from the stress of Linda's harassment campaign. I arranged for my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, to collect my mail and keep an eye on the property, and I left contact information in case of any emergencies. When I returned, Sunday evening, Mrs. Patterson was waiting in her driveway with an expression I had never seen before. A mixture of anger, shock, and what looked like genuine fear. She told me that on Saturday morning, Linda had arrived at my property with 2 other people and what appeared to be a portable water pump. Mrs. Patterson had initially assumed they were there to perform some kind of maintenance work that I had arranged. But when she went outside to say hello, Linda had been surprisingly rude and dismissive. According to Mrs. Patterson, Linda had claimed that she was responding to an environmental emergency that required immediate intervention to prevent contamination of the neighborhood water supply. She said that my pool's chemical levels had reached dangerous concentrations that posed health risks to surrounding properties, and that she had authorization from environmental compliance authorities to drain the pool immediately. Mrs. Patterson had asked to see this authorization, but Linda had refused, claiming that the situation was too urgent for bureaucratic delays. When Mrs. Patterson had offered to call me to confirm that this work was approved, Linda had told her that property owners who created environmental hazards forfeited their right to delay emergency response measures. The most chilling detail of Mrs. Patterson's account was that Linda and her assistants had worked methodically and efficiently, as if they had planned every aspect of their operation in advance. They had brought professional-grade equipment, they knew exactly where my pool's drainage systems were located, and they had completed the entire job in less than 3 hours. Mrs. Patterson had called the police while the draining was in progress, but when officers arrived, Linda had presented them with official-looking documents claiming that she was authorized to perform emergency environmental remediation on properties that posed public health risks. The officers had been confused by the situation, but since Linda appeared to have proper documentation, and since there was no obvious criminal activity taking place, they had decided not to intervene in what appeared to be a civil dispute. By the time I walked into my backyard that Sunday evening, my beautiful pool was nothing but an empty concrete shell surrounded by water-stained decking and the lingering smell of chlorine. 20,000 gallons of perfectly clean, properly balanced water had been pumped out and dumped into the storm drainage system, creating exactly the kind of environmental impact that Linda claimed to be preventing. But the real shock was yet to come. Taped to my back door was a formal letter from Linda, written on official HOA letterhead and copied to what appeared to be every government environmental agency in the state. The letter explained that emergency drainage of my pool had been necessary to prevent contamination of groundwater and neighboring properties due to excessive chemical concentrations that violated federal clean water standards. The letter included detailed documentation of chemical readings that were supposedly taken from my pool water, showing chlorine and pH levels that would have been dangerous if they were accurate. It also included photographs of what appeared to be environmental damage to vegetation around my pool area, suggesting that chemical runoff had been killing plants and creating soil contamination. Every single detail in Linda's documentation was fabricated. My pool service company had tested the water just 3 days before I left for my trip, and all chemical levels had been well within normal ranges. The supposed environmental damage to my landscaping was actually caused by Linda's drainage operation, not by any pre-existing contamination. But Linda's documentation looked official and comprehensive, and anyone reviewing it without independent verification would have concluded that emergency intervention had been justified and necessary. That's when I realized the true scope of Linda's campaign against me. This wasn't just harassment or petty neighborhood politics. This was systematic fraud designed to justify property destruction and create a public record of violations that didn't actually exist. Linda had convinced herself that she was protecting the neighborhood from my irresponsible behavior, but she was willing to commit actual crimes to enforce her imaginary authority over my property. The question now was whether I could prove what had really happened before Linda's false documentation became the official version of events. The morning after discovering my drained pool, I began what would become a months-long process of documenting Linda's fraud and fighting to clear my name from the false environmental violations she had created. My first call was to my pool service company, asking them to provide written documentation of all chemical readings and maintenance work they had performed on my property over the previous 6 months. The records they provided were invaluable. Not only did they show that my pool had consistently maintained proper chemical balance, but they also included detailed photographs taken during each service visit that clearly showed my landscaping and pool area in perfect condition right up until the weekend of the drainage incident. Next, I contacted each of the government agencies that had conducted inspections of my property earlier in the summer. I explained what had happened and asked for copies of their official reports, confirming that my property had been in full compliance with all environmental regulations. Several of the inspectors remembered my case specifically because my pool maintenance had been so exemplary compared to other properties they typically investigated. But the most important evidence came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson, who had witnessed the entire drainage operation, had been so disturbed by Linda's behavior that she had taken photos and video footage from her upstairs window. Her documentation clearly showed Linda and her assistants pumping clean water from my pool, while Linda simultaneously collected plant samples and soil specimens that she would later claim as evidence of pre-existing environmental damage. Mrs. Patterson's footage also captured Linda deliberately damaging some of my landscaping during the drainage process, pulling up healthy plants and pouring concentrated pool chemicals directly onto vegetation to create the appearance of chemical burn damage that would support her false contamination claims. Armed with this evidence, I filed a comprehensive complaint with the County Sheriff's Department, documenting Linda's pattern of harassment, her fraudulent environmental claims, and her deliberate destruction of my property. I also filed complaints with each government agency that had received her false reports, providing evidence that her documentation had been fabricated and that her emergency drainage operation had been completely unjustified. The legal response was swift and decisive. Linda's claim that she had authorization for emergency environmental intervention fell apart immediately when investigators discovered that no such authorization had ever been issued. Her documentation of chemical violations was proven false when my pool service company's records showed normal readings taken just hours before her supposed emergency readings. Most damaging to Linda's case was the revelation that she had filed similar false complaints against 3 other homeowners over the previous 2 years, all of whom lived on non-HOA properties, and all of whom had refused to comply with her unofficial neighborhood standards. The pattern of fraud was unmistakable, and investigators realized they were dealing with someone who had been systematically abusing government agencies to harass neighbors who would not submit to her authority. Linda was eventually charged with filing false reports, property destruction fraud, and abuse of office in her capacity as HOA president. The criminal case against her included restitution for the cost of refilling and rebalancing my pool, replacement of damaged landscaping, and compensation for the time and expense I had incurred defending against her false accusations. But the legal consequences were only part of Linda's downfall. When the HOA membership learned about her pattern of illegal behavior and abuse of authority, they immediately voted to remove her from the board and initiated their own investigation into how she had been conducting community business. They discovered that Linda had been using HOA letterhead and resources to harass non-member homeowners for years, creating legal liability for the entire organization. The HOA ended up issuing formal apologies to several homeowners who had been targets of Linda's harassment campaigns, and they implemented new policies to prevent board members from acting outside their legal authority. They also made it clear to all residents that their jurisdiction was limited to member properties and that they had no authority to enforce rules or standards on homes that weren't part of the association. Linda's reputation in the neighborhood was completely destroyed. Several families who had supported her environmental crusade against me publicly apologized when they learned the truth about her manufactured evidence and fraudulent complaints. The consensus among residents was that Linda's obsession with control had crossed the line from annoying to dangerous, and that her willingness to lie to government authorities and destroy other people's property made her unfit for any kind of community leadership role. But perhaps the most satisfying part of Linda's comeuppance was the discovery of why she had been so obsessed with my pool in the first place. During the investigation into her fraudulent activities, it came out that Linda had been planning to install a pool in her own backyard for over 3 years, but had been repeatedly denied permits due to drainage and environmental concerns specific to her property's location. Linda's harassment of me had nothing to do with legitimate environmental concerns or community standards. It was pure jealousy and resentment that I had been able to enjoy a pool that she couldn't have. Her entire campaign of false complaints and fraudulent documentation had been motivated by the petty desire to destroy something that reminded her of her own limitations and failures. The investigation also revealed that Linda had been researching ways to force me to sell my property, hoping that she could eventually purchase it herself and gain access to the pool that had become an obsession for her. Her escalating harassment had been designed to make my life so miserable that I would eventually give up and move away, leaving the property available for her to acquire. When I learned this, I realized that Linda's behavior had never been about neighborhood standards or environmental protection. It had been about a middle-aged woman's inability to accept that someone else had something she wanted and couldn't have. The final chapter in this saga came 6 months later, when Linda and her husband quietly put their house on the market and moved away from the neighborhood. The stress of the criminal charges, the loss of her community leadership position, and the complete destruction of her reputation had made it impossible for her to continue living in a place where everyone knew the truth about her behavior. Her house sold quickly, but for significantly less than comparable properties in the area. The real estate agent later told me that potential buyers had been concerned about purchasing a home from someone who had been involved in neighborhood disputes and legal troubles, even though Linda's criminal behavior had nothing to do with the property itself. As for me, I had my pool refilled and professionally cleaned, and I continued to enjoy my peaceful suburban lifestyle without interference from self-appointed neighborhood enforcers. The experience taught me valuable lessons about the importance of documenting harassment, understanding your property rights, and standing up to bullies who try to use official-sounding authority to control behavior they have no legal right to influence. The most important takeaway from this entire experience is that some people will go to shocking lengths to maintain their illusion of control over other people's lives. Linda Morrison convinced herself that she was protecting the neighborhood from environmental hazards, but she was really just a petty tyrant who couldn't accept that her authority had limits. Her willingness to fabricate evidence, file false reports with government agencies, and destroy other people's property revealed the dangerous mentality that can develop when someone becomes convinced that their personal preferences should override other people's property rights and legal protections. This story serves as a warning to anyone who lives in or near an HOA community. Know your rights, document everything, and never assume that someone's official-sounding claims about authority or regulations are actually legitimate. Linda's fraud succeeded for as long as it did, because I initially assumed that her environmental concerns might have some basis in reality, even though I knew she had no legal authority over my property. If I had immediately challenged her first letter with demands for specific documentation and legal citations, I might have avoided months of harassment and the eventual destruction of my pool. The lesson is clear. When someone claims authority over your property or behavior, make them prove it with legitimate legal documentation before you even consider cooperating with their demands. Linda Morrison drained my pool claiming federal law violations that didn't exist, armed with authority she didn't have, enforcing rules that didn't apply to my property. But in the end, her campaign of harassment and fraud destroyed her own life far more thoroughly than it ever damaged mine. Sometimes the best revenge against a neighborhood tyrant is simply letting their own behavior expose them for what they really are. Linda's obsession with controlling my property ultimately revealed her true character to everyone who had once respected her leadership, and the community justice that followed was more complete than anything I could have achieved through confrontation or retaliation. The question I'll leave you with is this. How many Linda Morrisons are lurking in suburban neighborhoods across the country, using official-sounding letters and implied authority to bully homeowners who don't know their rights? And more importantly, what will you do if you encounter one of them in your own community? Remember, the power to say no to unreasonable demands is the first line of defense against people who mistake their personal preferences for legal authority. Don't let anyone drain your pool, literal or metaphorical, without making them prove they have the right to do it.